I would like to talk today about practical actions for science workplaces to improve science workplaces for LGBT people. I've missed the word improve out of my title, but because I was so focused on putting the word physical in brackets, because what I'm going to be talking to you today about is some work that the Institute of Physics, the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society of Chemistry conducted last year on the workplace environment for LGBT people in the physical sciences. And although, of course, workplaces in physical sciences and chemical sciences, biological sciences, and other branches are very similar, we do realise that there are distinctions and differences between those workplaces. So I always try and put the word physical in brackets because that's what the data set was, but I think we can all take some initiative and learn from the work that the IOP, the RSE and the Royal Astronomical Society did. So hi, my name is James Claverley. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a, there we go. I am a white, cisgendered, homosexual male. I'm poly. I work for the National Physical Laboratory, and I am also a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Institute of Physics. I do a bit of tweeting, and I'm also a trustee of a charity called Pride in STEM, of which some of you may know about us. We were one of the first science-based charities for LGBT people in the UK, or charitable trusts in the UK, and we march in London Pride as often as we can. We're a jolly group. One of the things that I think I'm most proud about when we march in Pride is our audience participation and audience engagement. So here's a picture of me engaging with the Pride crowd. I'm showing them uranium glass balls glowing under UV light. So the introduction to that was, would you like to see my glowing balls? We also do, some other audience participation as you go. If any of you have attended London Pride, you know that no matter how hard the parade tries, it still takes a long time, and there's a lot of starting and stopping. So we thought this would be great to engage with the crowd. So that's a little bit about me. This is a science symposium, a STEM symposium. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about the science that I used to do. I'm no longer an in the laboratory scientist. I'm quite science adjacent, but my home and my schooling is definitely in the lab. And these are the labs that I currently work at. This is the National Physical Laboratory, which is based in southwest London. It's a very empty building at the moment, but it's still a very vibrant organisation, which I'd like to tell you a little bit about. We're the UK's National Measurement Institute. We are a world-leading centre of excellence in developing and applying the most accurate measurement standards, science and technology. So every country has access to a National Measurement Institute. In the United States, the NMI in the United States is called NIST. In Germany, it's PTB. And in the UK, it's the National Physical Laboratory. As a measurement laboratory, the science of measurement or metrology is something that is absolutely at the heart of everything we do at NPL. And the statement that we usually try and engage in audiences with, but it works particularly well with scientific audiences as well, is that it's measurement that makes science scientific. The scientific method is based in measurement, not mathematics. So usually, if I make this presentation to a large room, there's audible inhales as I say this. But hear me out. It's the fact that we need to make comparison of theoretical, which are generally mathematical predictions, with experimental results, and that's what makes the scientific process what it is. and its metrology. It's the measurements, the experimental results that allow that to happen. For me, the measurements that I was involved in when I started at NPO, when I was in the laboratory, and as a PhD student as well, were length measurements, particularly micro length measurements. So this is a set of examples of things that I liked to measure, that got me up in the morning. And how do you measure these things? They're micro parts. These 4 examples are from a watch. Just from from the active parts of a chronometer, but you can see that they're highly complex parts, and in order for the watch or the chronometer or any sort of micro machine to work, these parts, which are often made in different locations using different techniques, need to be able to be assembled, fit together, work first time, and operate for extended periods of time. And in a watch, that's something that you've got with you and you rely on quite a lot. But if it's a pacemaker, for example, or if it's a micro machine that's keeping you alive, or is essential for safety, or is essential for security, then you really don't want to be having to replace that. There's a huge range of these kind of micro parts that are functional, that are absolutely essential for the smooth running of everyday life. There's just some examples here. The one that I usually point out is this part here. This is a ferrule for fiber optics. So these cylinders, even smaller here, these are sort of sub-millimeter sized features. They need to be perfectly circular to a tolerance and to an accuracy, and cylindrical. The sides need to be parallel. Because otherwise, the optical fibers that are going to be carrying information, that are going to be carrying your internet, going to be carrying your telephone calls, they won't work properly. These parts are medical parts, so not only do we have material issues here and surface finish issues, but again, you don't want your medical parts to need replacing, to wear, etc., etc. So there's a wide range of parts that I was interested in. And just to give you a little glance at my PhD, which unfortunately I realized recently was 10 years ago. No, 8 years ago, so it's not quite so bad yet. This is the device that I developed for my PhD. This is a micro machine for measuring micro machines. It's a MEMS device, a micro electromechanical system, which I designed and had manufactured and operated, which I won't go into any detail, but essentially, to give you an idea of the size, this flexure here, which is a very thin piece of electrode deposited nickel, is 2 millimeters long. The stylus, which is running perpendicular into the slide, perpendicular to this plane here, is 2 millimeters long. And at the end of this 2 millimeter long stylus, we have a microsphere, which is 50 microns in diameter. So that's 0.05 millimeters. I'd love to say that I know how this was made. This was made for me by an amazing group in Taiwan who work with electro discharge machining, assembled by one of my colleagues at the University of Nottingham. And overall, this is the kind of device that we use to measure the parts that I just showed you. That's the science for this talk. So I'm really sorry that was 10 minutes of science, because the rest of this talk is going to be about the topic of improving the workplace for LGBT scientists. And the reason why this is important, not just for scientists, but for any workplace, is because it was a fact that Generation Y, and that's my generation, were 62% of my generation when graduating from university went back in the closet when they started their first jobs. So Generation Y is the millennials. We started our first jobs in sort of around the year 2000, mid 2000s, and going back into the closet is something that I had to deal with personally. When I moved to NPL, I went straight back into the closet. I went from an open and inclusive university environment to an environment that I didn't know about. And actually, I think not knowing was one of the worst things, because it subsequently has turned out that the National Physical Laboratory is an incredibly diverse and inclusive organization to work for. They just weren't being open about it. And that's also one of the issues that we're facing, is that, coming into an organization, a new organization, where there's no visible LGBT engagement or LGBT role models or anything like that, you go into the closet through the need to be safe and to stay safe and to not affect your career. That's what I ended up doing, and I ended up staying in the closet for sort of 3 or 4 years, which was a total waste of my time, a total waste of my energy. All of that energy that I could have been spending finishing my PhD in less than the 7 years that it took me to finish my PhD. I would have had a much better and much smoother experience. And when I did come out and realize that NPL was a very inclusive organization, I really wanted to change that. And I realized that that was something that was similar across a lot of organizations, and the Institute of Physics and the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society of Chemistry also had these kind of anecdotes. And so 2 years now, we launched a survey to explore the workplace for LGBT physical sciences and scientists. And last year we were lucky enough to launch this publicly. We had a wonderful launch event at the Royal Society of Chemistry in their very grand library at Burlington House. And it was coupled as well with commitment from the 3 organizations to really hold these results and the recommendation of this report as part of their ongoing strategy. Commitment from these organizations and commitment from all organizations to make workplaces better is really important, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take sort of 5-10 minutes to quickly go through the results, the key results of this report. I'll caveat this with the fact that the results are all publicly. Everything that I'm presenting is publicly available in the report, which is downloadable from the IOP, the RSC, and the RAS websites. You can just Google it. But one of the things that I'm going to do is try to give a little bit of context as to what these actually mean. And one of the phrases that we usually use when we're talking about the results of this and similar surveys, although this survey was one of the largest surveys of LGBT scientists ever conducted so far that we know of, is that although it is looking okay, that there actually isn't gold at the end of the rainbow at the moment. It's not looking pretty, and we've got some important work that we need to do. And what we really want to use this report for is to be the proof, the data that we need in order to prove that things aren't okay, and we really need to make changes. So I'm going to go through the results quite quickly, and then I really want to get to the practical actions, and that's what I hope you will be able to take away from this, not only just for you, but also for your organizations, for your groups, for your teams, and hopefully it'll be of some use to you. So one of the first things that we concluded on from the report is that this is really about retention. This is really about making people feel comfortable in their workplace, making them feel included, making them feel welcome, because then they can get on and do the work that they need to do. They can further their careers, they can make the scientific discoveries that they need to make, and they can stay in their workplaces and be productive. And it's extremely important to note that, you know, when we ask the question about had you ever considered leaving your workplace because of negative climate or discrimination towards LGBT people, non-LGBT respondents, of which there were quite a few, so we have a good data set there, said that 16% they had considered leaving. LGBT respondents as a whole, 28% of them had considered leaving. And the important thing to note about that middle roundel, where it says 20% of trans respondents, they considered often leaving their workplace because of climate or discrimination towards LGBT people. 1 in 5 trans people feel so uncomfortable in their scientific, in their STEM workplace, in their physical sciences workplace, that they often consider leaving their job. And that's a really damning number that I think our organisations need to look at very carefully and understand the implications that that might mean to those people. And one of the things that this report did, we were very adamant, particularly the membership who were leading on sort of pushing the institutes to do this work. We really wanted personal experiences to shine through. So you'll see, if you read the report, a lot of quotes. I'm not going to read all of these quotes because there are quite a few of them as we go through. But it's important to know that, you know, this kind of discrimination, it is real. So on the right hand side, this is a quote from a manager. "I had a hard time as a manager promoting a great lesbian scientist. Was it because she was lesbian, female, quiet, non-aggressive? I'm not sure. I just know that her pay was lower than her male group members, and that there were often more questions about her regarding promotion or merit raises. My documentation for her promotion took 3 years to develop, and it had to be meticulous. The burden of proof was higher." You know, so this is also an issue with, intersectionality as well. We just really can't unpick a lot of this stuff, but you know, these kind of discriminations, they are real, they do happen, and we now have the data to sort of prove it. We dug a little bit deeper into that information, and we actually asked about experiences or observed exclusionary behaviour. And again, if you look in the middle here, so that when we asked, had you in the past 12 months experienced or observed exclusionary, intimidating, or offensive or harassing behaviour because of sexual identity, you know, heterosexuals noted that you know, they had experienced it. About 10% had. That number immediately goes up for gay and asexual people. Lesbians, it's even higher. And when we take in again for bi and pansexual, 18%. All others, again, is up into sort of 27% in total. So that, you know, those numbers as well are higher than our heterosexual colleagues, which is something that we need to consider. When we split this information up by gender or trans status, the numbers are even worse. So if we look at cis respondents, for example, 15% had experienced or observed exclusionary behaviour, 32%, 1/3 of trans people are reporting exclusionary behaviour. And that number is similar for non-binary compared to the binary split of male and female. And this kind of exclusionary behaviour is prevalent. So again, going back to these quotes, I am going to read these two out because, you know, on the left we have a response from a cisgendered man who may be classed as a troll. University is meant to be a professional working environment, so as to why this questionnaire is asking me such childish questions is beyond me. Outside of the physics department, in more social settings, this would be fine, but inside the department, we are all just scientists regardless of our gender or asexual orientation. Well, the person on the right, a trans, feminine, non-binary, queer scientist, who talks about their manager working very hard to make sure that their pronouns were used correctly, that the team knew about their pronouns, and that made them feel more included, more comfortable in the workplace, is exactly the kind of quote and exactly the kind of situation that proves the person on the left completely wrong. And I think those kind of personal experiences are really what is in the heart of the work that we were doing here. We also looked at the implementation of workplace policies. We found it to be uneven. In fact, in some cases, we found that people considered their current workplace policies to be discriminatory rather than helpful in the slightest. And that also, we saw a relationship then between outness as well, so that, you know, the more out you are, the more supportive you thought your workplace policies were. And there may be a link there to people being more out in the workplace are generally in a more inclusive workplace, which will have more inclusive policies. Some of this is supposition, but again, this data is useful now for as a starting point for us to grow on. And again, we have some really rich information and contextual information around this, particularly around signalling. So this is an interesting one on the left around the minimum signalling is to have some kind of policy that includes LGBT in the statement. That's quite interesting. So do you have an LGBT inclusion policy at your organization? So I, for one, can put my hand up and say, you know, the National Physical Laboratory does not, and that might be a really good stepping stone. Workplaces, and so following on from my supposition, again, we were looking at how comfortable and uncomfortable people felt with outness, and again, workplaces with visible LGBT physical sciences were felt to be more comfortable. And, you know, the numbers of outness as well are quite interesting. You know, under 50% for lesbian and gay people, queer and questioning people at 21, and the fact that that bi and pansexual number is even smaller than queer and questioning, I think is really endemic of sort of the bi-erasure and biphobia that we might be seeing in our workplaces currently. And there are, again, quotes that support all of these. I'm aware that some of these slides are a bit wall of text, so I'm gonna skip over these, but I encourage you to pick up the report. The quotes are in big coloured letters all the way through the report, and they really bring to life some of the data that we're talking about. An interesting point was around the internationality of our community, and the fact that as scientists we are often encouraged to travel and to second into other organisations wherever they are in the world. And I've used some of these quotes particularly to engage with my colleagues and my managers and the managers at the National Physical Laboratory to remind them that actually asking an LGBT scientist to travel to some places in the world is really not the kind of thing that we should be forcing people to do, and the way that the organisation addresses that is still something that we're sort of struggling with and trying to understand what the best way to address that is. So you know, best practice in this area is something that we're really interested in learning about, so that we can support our LGBT staff. I often take the opportunity to show them this awful map of the world, where, you know, well over half of the world it is not safe for LGBT people to travel, to work, you know, to exist, to be, and be, you know, being able to show my managers these kind of graphs is really important. And finally, we are able to talk about sort of how organizations can be more inclusive and the work of networks. This particular point is important because if you look at the so down here, the color coding is we ask the question of teachers, of people who work in scientific roles, people who applied at universities, and PhD students. So people that were aware of networks. When you look at the teachers and the work in scientific roles, you know, they were either had no networks or staff networks to join, or they were unaware of them, and that again, completely switches over where, if you're employed at university or a PhD student, you are aware of, and there are official student networks, official staff student networks, official staff networks, and this just does not exist for teachers or for people who work in scientific roles. So again, sort of technicians or people that work in non-academic organisations. So the prevalence of that is really important. So one of the conclusions to this is that despite all of this progress, the workplace climate is uneven. It's a mix, and there's definitely a lot of work that we can do to fix that. And again, the report gives us a lot of pointers, gives us a lot of sort of starting points. It's not the only thing that we should do, but it's really good starting points. And I'd like to go through a couple of these now to finish off. The Institute of Physics, the Royal Astronomical Society, and the Royal Society of Chemistry believe that there are three main areas that people should consider when they start in this journey. We need to build visibly welcoming communities. We need to review and improve existing policies, so we need to get our paperwork in order, and we need to introduce and we need to improve training in this area. And point number 2 and point number 3 support number 1. For me, this is also a hierarchy, that number 1 is the most important thing that we should be doing. And they also gave some examples of actions that individuals and employers and institutions, and I often put in brackets as well, this is not just the this is not just the learned institutions, but this is institutions like the research councils and funding bodies, etc., can do. We have a lot of discussions about these three categories of actions, because for me the individuals one is quite interesting. The individuals one is the burden of this work does not lie with the individual. The burden of this work lies with the employers and the institutions. But there are some things that individuals can do if they feel comfortable to do so, if they feel safe to do so, and if they wish to empower themselves to support. But the burden of this work and fixing this problem is definitely with the employers and the institutions. But we as individuals can give them a bit of a kick. So if we were to look at building a visibly welcoming community, individuals, if you feel comfortable, you can be visible. You should always be respectful. We should all be respectful. But remaining safe as well is a particularly important point. Be aware of your own mental health and your well-being, and be aware of the mental health and well-being of people around you. That is something that we as individuals can easily do. Employers have a lot that they need to take on board, including setting clear behavioural expectations, collecting this data and acting on it, being active members of LGBT organisations, actively promoting their staff networks, sorting their facilities out, things like that. Institutions can do similar things, but they also need to, well, first of all, I would like the three institutions to repeat this survey in 3 to 5 years' time so we can see a trend, as any good scientist would do, and can promote guidance to running inclusive events. So one of the things that I've done, and I did this quite recently, is being a visible ally for transgender people. I prepared a virtual seminar for International Transgender Day of Visibility, and I try and wear my pronoun badges on my lanyard at all times. The policies one, it's a bit paperwork focused, so I'm gonna rush through this quite quickly. But again, as an individual, be an advocate if you can. Call out policies that you think are incorrect and need changing, and be aware of what your institution policies are in case anyone has any questions. Employers need to do quite a lot. They need to audit their policies, and there are loads of great organisations that can help you do that. You really need a clear bullying and harassment policy, particularly around the deliberate misuse of pronouns. So one of the things that's important to note here is that at the National Physical Laboratory, if you consistently and deliberately misuse someone's pronouns, that is classed as bullying and harassment, and it will be treated accordingly. And similarly, keep reviewing your workspaces and your equipment. Set up and review the responsibility in terms of reference for equality and diversity through the organisation. So do you have champions? Do you have a diversity and inclusion committee? Again, the institutions have got some specific work that they need to do. One thing that was really highlighted is that these institutions, they are not well set up at the moment to dealing with people who transition midway through their career. We really need to be much better at enabling trans members of institutions to change their details, and that those details are consistently used. And we need to develop expectations and behaviour guidelines for our members. One of the things that the Institute of Physics does is, for instance, has a code of conduct for any seminars, any presentations, any events that are held, sponsored by the Institute of Physics. And as I mentioned, there are a load of organisations that will help you audit your policies for LGBT inclusion. I mentioned Stonewall because NPL is a Stonewall diversity champion, but there are a load of other organisations that that you can turn to. In terms of introducing, improving training, again, it's quite obvious in a lot of places, but it's really useful to have this stuff written down with the IOP logo on the front, and so you can really look to your employer and say, look, you need to be able to provide training, you need to be able to allow and empower your managers to not only understand some of the conflicts and some of the difficulties that they might be facing and their staff might be facing, but give them the ability to follow up following these trainings with all of their staff in reviews and one-to-ones. Here, the institutions have got a lot to do. They need to be able to develop this kind of training. They need to be able to signpost this kind of training. And as individuals, we can request that training is made available. And when we attend that training, being an active participant, I think is really key. And again, I just highlight one particular organisation that NPL uses. So in terms of trans inclusion training, sort of Trans 101, and then more detailed, how to line manage people who are, how to line manage better and be more trans inclusive in your line management. Gendered Intelligence is one that's based in London, which is a really key organisation that NPL works with. One of the things that's interesting to note here is a lot of the guidance. I'll just go back to this point here. Providing training on transgender inclusion and correct pronoun usage for staff, whether or not you have transgender staff. It's very important that people understand that one of the reasons why you might not have transgender staff is because you are not a transgender inclusive organisation. And again, having that written down, having that with the IOP logo on the front, being able to hand that to your head of your physics, or your chief scientist, is a really useful tool to use. On that note, I'm going to finish. That was a whirlwind tour, and I realise I'm a few minutes over my time. But I hope that you take the opportunity to download and skim this report, read this report. Some of the quotes are really quite empowering. Some of them are quite sad. These are real quotes from real LGBT scientists who are struggling with their career, who are struggling with workplaces that may not be inclusive as employers think they are, and things really need to change. And I hope I've given you some examples of things that we can do, and that employers can do, and that institutions can do to really make these numbers turn around. Thank you very much.